Hi, I'm Davy. I'm awesome. Welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things, all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. So this week, I'm reviewing a documentary that has been out since 2018. It is currently available on the streaming service Max, as it was an HBO exclusive documentary, Andre the Giant. As we know, Andre the Giant, one of the most beloved and legendary wrestlers to ever grace a wrestling ring. Now, there have been several documentaries about Andre the Giant. Let's see how this one differs. I mean, for one, I will say this is the first documentary I remember seeing that actually had his family in it. Had his brothers, Anthony and Jacques, I think I said their names right, and Anthony's wife, giving their views in this documentary. And of course, it had many former colleagues and wrestling historians, just to name a few. It had Jerry Lawler, Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon. I know he's not very popular at the moment, but remember, this documentary was done in 2018, and of course he would have a lot to say about Andre the Giant. Had Mean Gene Okerlund before his passing, Ric Flair, Tim White, even had Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, talking about his experience with Andre the Giant. But it begins with his brothers talking about how he started getting noticeably big when he was 15 years old. He was the middle kid, but they noticed like he was towering over everybody by 15. I also like that in this documentary, very quickly, they had audio clips of Andre the Giant from some old interviews, and it was kind of cool. Going all the way back to when he was Jean Ferry. Of course, he started wrestling in France, where he was from, but then how his first exposure to North American wrestling was getting booked in Montreal, of all places, which was a hot territory back then. And of course, because this guy was 300 pounds and over 7 feet tall, they did mention that in this documentary, how they billed him as 7'4", and they're not entirely sure that's exactly how tall he was. They just know that definitely he was over 7 feet tall. But either way, because of this, he was an attraction. He was a draw. You were going to sell out arenas just to see the giant guy. But because of that, he wasn't like routinely in any territory. Like, he was never wrestling every week in a territory like most guys do, where they would come in, wrestle several times a week, every week, for several months, and then move on to the next territory and eventually come back. He'd be the attraction, wrestle his match, and so as to keep the allure, he'd be gone the next day, going to another territory, just basically traveling all around doing this, which is actually what led to him being called Andre the Giant. While he was traveling around, there was a couple of promoters that were calling him the Giant Frenchman, simply the Giant, just all over the place, because again, attraction. People were like, oh, I'm gonna go and see a giant. Until one of the promoters didn't want to just simply call him a giant, didn't want to call him the Giant Frenchie or the Giant Frenchman, but wanted giant in his name. And they said, well, he wrestles by Jean Ferry. And he said, well, I can't call him the Giant Fairy. What's his real name? And they told him, Andre Roussimoff. He said, okay, Andre the Giant. There you go. But what some of the other wrestlers brought up that they loved about Andre the Giant was not only was he a big draw, but big guys like him would usually not be very good at selling for other wrestlers. What they loved about Andre was that he would sell for everyone. He was always going to win the match, but he was always going to make them look good. Which made sense, because back then it wasn't going to hurt them at all to lose to somebody that much bigger than them, but it would make them look good that they put up a good fight. But they did mention, if he didn't like you, watch out. And that's long been documented, that Andre would occasionally lose to people if he had to, but if he didn't like the person, he refused to lose to them. Not only would he refuse to lose to them, he wouldn't sell for them, and he'd hurt them. And they mentioned some of the wrestlers that he did not like. He didn't like Randy Savage. Seemingly the biggest reason he didn't like Randy Savage was Randy Savage would cover himself in the baby oil and it would get all over him, and he would tell him stop with the baby oil and he wouldn't, so he made him regret it. He didn't like the Iron Sheik because the Iron Sheik was mouthy, so he shut his mouth. They mentioned one of the biggest ones that he did not like, which is funny considering they made history at the first WrestleMania, was Big John Studd. First of all, at the time, Andre was the only one who would get in the ring coming over the top rope. Then John Studd started doing that. Back then it was very protected. You don't do things that the other guys do. Like, if they do this move, you don't do that move. If they enter this way, you don't enter that way. If they wear this kind of robe, you don't wear that kind of robe. It was something that could start a fight between wrestlers. He didn't want to get into a fight with Andre the Giant. But it talked about some of the hardships for Andre. Like, for example, traveling. One of the most grueling things about being a professional wrestler is all the travel. In fact, in almost every interview with almost every wrestler, if they ever do ask, what's the one thing about this job you hate? 99 out of 100 wrestlers, the first thing they're going to say is the travel. That 1 out of the 100, he'll mention it as the second or third thing he just doesn't like. But all the wrestlers agree that's the worst thing, and for him it was even more difficult. There were times he could not get a car because he'd be at a car rental place and the only rentals they had, he couldn't fit. There would be times he would get a hotel room, but they did not have any beds that were big enough for him. When he would be on a plane, he'd have to get 2 seats, push the armrest up and sit in both because a single seat could not fit him. And he'd be on sometimes international flights, 13, 14 hours long, and he could never use the bathroom because those bathrooms are just too freaking small. But another hardship for him was being out in public as it was. They mentioned how a lot of celebrities, it's hard for them to go out in public, get mobbed, they get stared at, they just want to blend in, but most of them can in some ways. They can put on a big coat and a hat or something and kind of keep their head down and people will not notice them. How are you going to hide a 7-foot-plus tall guy like Andre? He couldn't go anywhere without people staring, people pointing, people making jokes sometimes. And it did hurt him. He was sensitive, which is one reason he drank a lot. And it went into that, his legendary drinking abilities. How he could drink 6 bottles of wine in a sitting and not feel anything. They mentioned how he drank a minimum of 26 beers a day, and that was just the way like a guy might have a couple beers. But they not only went to how much he would drink, for some reason they decided to go into how much he would fart. Apparently he liked to fart. And he liked to do that thing where he trapped people in elevators and stuff and fart. And his farts were really bad, and okay, he was a dude, he liked fart humor. Feel like they could have left that out. But another way they kind of differentiated themselves from other documentaries I've seen, this is the first documentary that I can tell you I've seen about Andre the Giant, which I've seen several, that had his daughter, Robin Christensen. And I mentioned how he was hardly ever around, hardly ever saw her, and he didn't like that, but it was just the wrestler lifestyle. He didn't want her a part of it, her mother didn't want her a part of it, and it did break his heart. They talked about it all the time, how he wanted to be closer to his daughter. And then of course they took a little segment in this documentary to go into his experience in one of my favorite movies of all time, easily in my top 10, The Princess Bride, and had interviews with several cast members, Carrie Ellis, Robin Wright, Billy Crystal, the director Rob Reiner, talking about their experiences with Andre, how much they loved him. But then they got into the more tragic stuff of how he broke his ankle, and even though he would normally ignore going to the doctors, this was one time he kind of had to. He had to go to a doctor and get his ankle fixed. He needed surgery. And that doctor is the one that recognized the signs and tested him to find out he had giganticism. This was in his 20s, and talked about how there was no cure for giganticism at the time, but there was treatment, but he rejected it. Even though they told him without treatment, you'll be lucky to live past 40. Because he's nonstop growing, but his organs aren't, and they can't keep up with that. And probably the biggest chunk of the documentary that they decided to focus on was his legendary match with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 3. This part took up so much of the documentary that I'm only going to really touch on it. But basically, Andre telling Vince McMahon that his body's breaking down, he wants to retire, but Vince convincing him to do WrestleMania 3, and him wanting to do it because it was something basically to keep going for, as this has been hailed as the most important match in WrestleMania history. Not the best match in WrestleMania history, but the most important, and I would agree with that assessment. This was the match that catapulted WrestleMania into the status it is now. Before that, WrestleMania 1 and 2, they were huge events, but this was the one that catapulted it to where it's now yearly the biggest event in wrestling. Even when WWE wasn't the number one company, WCW was, WrestleMania was still the number one event. And it's thanks to this match, where he passed the torch to Hulk Hogan, going heel, the things that were laid out. Hogan went way into how he was afraid that Andre was going to decide, you know what, I don't want to lose, I want that title. What was Hogan going to do about it? Nothing. but Andre cared about the business more than himself and did the honors. I will say this is another disappointing thing about this documentary, though, is it kind of made it seem like that happened and then he just winded down and faded away into the sunset, did mostly tag teams, which was true for the end of his career. But for the next year, he still feuded with Hogan, and even about a year later, did take the title off of Hogan. You know, the whole thing where he won the title just to sell it to the $1 Million Man, and they said, no, you can't do that, so they vacated it. In WrestleMania 4, they had a one-night tournament, but they completely ignored that. Basically, after the WrestleMania 3 stories, just went more into his body breaking down until his father got very sick, and he went to his childhood home in France to be with his dad right before he died, stayed for the funeral, and he himself ended up passing away in Paris before he came back to the United States. And also went into how his entire estate was left to his daughter. But still, very sad ending to a legendary wrestler at the age of 46. Andre the Giant is a legend that surpasses even his generations. More legendary than I would say of many wrestlers, like even some of the top champions. I've encountered younger wrestling fans that weren't around during these times, who know who Andre the Giant is. Fans that weren't even alive when he was still alive. But they know who Andre the Giant is. But truth be told, some of the legendary wrestlers like Superstar Billy Graham, Pedro Morales, Jimmy Snuka, heck, I've even had the ones that are right now probably in the 20s and stuff, look at me with blank faces having no clue who even Bruno Sammartino was. But they know who Andre the Giant is. Everyone remembers Andre the Giant, even if you weren't around to remember him. I definitely remember him. I remember seeing him on WWF television. I'd be flipping the channels. If I saw Andre the Giant, I was going to stop and watch for a minute. Even back before I was the avid wrestling fan that I am now. And I remember being sad when hearing that he passed away when I was a little kid. He was just so cool. There was just such an aura about him. Even though by the time I was watching him, it was towards the end of his career when he wasn't that great anymore. His body was breaking down. He wasn't as mobile. He couldn't do much. But it's something that I hate about people saying oh, he was just a big guy, he couldn't really wrestle. You have to go watch his earlier stuff, his NWA days and stuff like that. Because you find that for such a big man, he could really go. So much so that I have no issue saying it. If he were around today, being able to do the stuff he was able to do during those days, he'd be able to keep up just fine with these wrestlers now. Yes, there have been other giants, some really good, some not so good, but there was and always will only be one, Andre the Giant. As far as this documentary itself goes, it is a great documentary. Yes, they did leave some big stuff out that I've seen in other documentaries, but I will say I don't think I've seen a documentary that encompasses his life and his stories quite as well as this one. This is easily my favorite Andre the Giant documentary. So, if you have Max, I suggest you go look it up and watch the HBO exclusive documentary of Andre the Giant. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications for when I post videos, and leave a comment I can respond to in my next comment corner. Tell me some of your favorite memories of Andre the Giant. And if you don't remember Andre the Giant, tell me some of the folklore you love about Andre the Giant. Love you guys.